Good evening. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. voiced his great call. "I have a dream," he said, "that one day this nation will rise up and live out the meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That was Dr. King's dream, and he was assassinated before it was realized. 12 years earlier, the poet Langston Hughes had written also of dreams. "What happens to a dream deferred?" he asked. "Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Does it explode?" We will talk about the question that Langston Hughes raised: what happens to a dream deferred? And more specifically this evening, we'll talk about what is happening to Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. To discuss that, we have come to Atlanta, Georgia, where Dr. King was buried, but where his dream lives on in the work of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Social Change, whose president is Mrs. Coretta Scott King, my guest this evening. Mrs. King is one of the leaders of the American Civil Rights and Full Employment movement. She has served as co-chairperson of the National Committee for Full Employment, a public delegate to the United Nations General Assembly, and as a commissioner of International Women's Year, among many, many other things. Mrs. King, in the 1950s and 1960s, great progress was obtained in the area of voting rights, and there was thought to be a connection between that kind of political achievement and economic and social achievement. And yet, the unemployment of black people in this country is greater today. The black youth unemployment in the city of Chicago, for example, is 37-40%. What is your assessment of that dream in its economic terms?
I think there is hope for the dream in terms of the economic struggle that was begun in 1968 in an official way when Martin announced the Poor People's Campaign and brought together the poor of this nation. Unfortunately, he was not able to carry on that campaign to its fruition. And then, as you recall, he was taken from us, and along with Bobby Kennedy, who were the two, one black and one white, symbol of, I think, the greatest symbol for people in this country of goodwill, one white and one black. Then we had an administration that came into power, political power, that began to talk about benign neglect. And what happened during that period was that despite the benign neglect, black people continued to get registered, and continue to vote year by year. They increased the voting rolls, and they elected more and more black elected officials until 1977. Blacks were able to elect a president. Now, to me, that is the continuation of the dream through the political process. As we talk about the movement for social change led by Martin, civil rights, political rights, economic rights. During the middle of the last period, say 68 to 1974, almost the middle of the Nixon-Ford administration, the Coalition for Full Employment was initiated. And I happen to be the person to initiate that coalition, with the help, of course, of others. But it was the center that sponsored the first conference in 1974 in June on full employment. And we knew then that there had to be legislation in order to bring about a full employment economy and to provide a job, decent job, a decent income for all persons who needed a job. Today we have a bill. The Humphrey Hawkins bill. Now, that bill has to be passed, and I think it can be, provided the people who believe in democracy, who believe enough in this country that to believe that this country must survive and can survive, will work for the passage of this bill.
But Mrs. King, what do you say?
The coalition, the same kind of coalition that was formed during the Civil Rights Movement to get the Voting Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1960 for. We have such a coalition. We have organized coalitions. Mary Finley is my co-chairperson of the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers in some 70 cities and more than 100 communities. And these are active groups. They don't have the name of full employment. They have all kinds of names. But they are part of our coalition. We're based in Washington. And we are working with others in coalition to get the legislation passed. Now, if we get it passed, it will be as significant, as far-reaching as the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Even though it's watered down, some of its critics now say.
Well,
it doesn't have the teeth that it needs.
Well, it's not watered down, as the critics say. In many ways, it's stronger than it was. Now, Hawkins, Augustus Hawkins, and Dr. Leon Kaislin, who really is responsible for authoring much of the legislation, has spent more than 40 years in this whole area, works very closely with the coalition as a board member, as a member of the Economic Task Force. And Leon Kaislin, and Gus Hawkins both have said that in many ways the bill is much stronger than it was before. It has teeth. What you have to realize is that for the first time in the history of this country, we have a bill that mandates that first of all, the government has made a commitment to it when it endorses it. The president has endorsed it. If it passes in Congress, it will mandate that the president will have to set some goals and will have to meet those goals within a given period of time. That means fiscal policies have to be set as well in order to meet those goals. You can't have goals without monetary and fiscal policies to meet them. So all that's provided in the bill. And the bill is very comprehensive. It's really a planning bill. And this is something that we've never had in this country.
But it really makes for a national policy that says
It's
people
policy.
have a right to
That's
a job.
right.
I mean, that's the real
That's the real
benchmark,
thing.
is it not?
That is correct. It says people have a right to a job, but it suggests any number of ways of achieving it that the president may use his discretion.
Not just
From
public
time
service
to time.
jobs, not just
Absolutely.
raking
No.
leaves, not just doing some of those make-work jobs.
Most of the jobs should be created in the private sector, but the government would then provide incentives for business. A bill of this kind would mean that you have to have tax reform, welfare reform, and labor law reform in order for it to pass. And of course, the president is working on tax reform. The labor law reform is also in the works. And welfare reform, that's already been proposed too. So steps in the direction of all these things are being taken at this point. Now, it's going to take some time. We're not going to get it overnight. And in 5 years, we may not get all that we want. But it's a very important step in the right direction. It took Sweden 30 years to have a full employment economy. And when they have 2% of unemployment, they have a major depression. Other Western nations have been able to do it, and we can do it. Certainly, this is the most affluent nation in the world. And I think what's so important now is that we have the commitment from the government saying that it is a right.
Mrs. King, when Dr. King was going throughout this country, seeking really to get this country to recognize that black people had a right to vote, that had been given them in the Constitution, but not given to them in real life, he was able to utilize great dramatic gestures in order to call public attention to this. He did it in the South, he did it in Chicago. Today, when we talk about the issue that you think is the number one issue, in which many people would agree with you, employment, the right to a job, we have 90 million Americans who are employed. We have 7% unemployed, 7 million unemployed, but 90 million Americans are employed, a record high. What can be done to touch the hearts of those whose plates are full? What can be done to move them to help out the other 7 million?
Well, I think that people more and more are realizing that we are all tied together. You know, what's good for poor people is also good for the private sector. Because when the economy is not, working, and if there's not a vibrant economy, business doesn't make any profit. It just makes good business sense, for business to realize, that when there is conflict, when there are factions in the community, and they're not going to be able to continue to operate their businesses and make profit. And they tend to want to run, to move out. But there's only so far you can run, because the problem is not only national, it's international. One of the reasons why our economy is in such bad shape is because the world economy is also messed up. And that is why it's so important for the leaders of the world to come together to try to solve this problem. As you remember, back in the spring last year, when the NATO nations met and President Carter was involved, they designated unemployment as the number one issue. And this is an international problem. It's not just a national problem. Many of our businesses, corporations, have moved into other countries, but even there, it creates a problem for us here. And the labor unions are very concerned because textiles, the textile industry is very concerned because their members are losing jobs because industries are moving other places. So there has to be some regulation working together throughout to solve the problem, and that's where we are interdependent. And more, I think, we are coming around to seeing this as we move forward, that a businessman here in Atlanta cannot be isolated, and be very satisfied with if he happens to be doing well when there are others around him who are not.
It is so interesting to hear you talk about the global aspects of this, because that is really what your late husband was doing also. He began to move out of the domestic concern only for human rights.
That's right.
And he really got in a lot of trouble, didn't he? I mean, he took on the Vietnam War, and it cost him dearly, did it not?
Yes, it did. Martin always had a world view. Even in the days of Montgomery, he did not see it as an isolated happening. In Montgomery, he saw the international significance of a Montgomery bus boycott that many people thought about as being an isolated movement, a campaign. Interestingly enough, that campaign inspired people around the world. There was a bus boycott in Johannesburg, South Africa, during that time. And you say, wonder why Johannesburg, South Africa, when you think of the problems in South Africa today. Well, we must remember that Mohandas K. Gandhi started his work in nonviolence in South Africa. So that somehow that philosophy and the power of that movement is so strong that some seeds were left there. And I often feel that even though the people of South Africa who were struggling for their freedom, they look to the king mystique, the king philosophy, the influence of Martin Luther King Jr. They say that Martin Luther King is their spiritual leader. Even in death, I hear them saying that Martin Luther King Jr. is our spiritual leader. We are following him in his footsteps. We're following him. And because they could relate to him, Gandhi left South Africa and went to India. And it took him 40 years to get the independence of India to come about. Martin, in 12 and a half years, changed the whole Southland with his movement, and much of the nation. I mean, when we realize what was achieved during that period, we have to understand. So this man had vision that encompassed the whole world, and he always said that, we're all tied together, and we cannot think in terms of our individual concerns. We've got to think in terms of our collective concerns. And in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, which was the last book that he wrote, one was published posthumously, but that was the last one that was published while he was alive. He has a chapter called The World House. And he talks about how we can never live separately anymore. And very often in his speeches, he used to talk about the fact that when you get up in the morning and you take your bath and you have to depend on half of the world before you have your breakfast, because the soap comes from an English, bread. I'm sort of having a little difficulty identifying where the soap comes from, but he mentioned where it came from. The sponge from the Pacific Islander, or the coffee from a Brazilian farmer, or the toast from an English farmer, speaking farmer, and so on. And he says, before you have your breakfast, to finish your breakfast, you have depended on half of the world. And when we realize this, when we realize and we take all the products in our homes and look at the labels and see where they come from, we realize, our interdependence. And so that Martin had a worldview, like Martin, Andy Young has a worldview at the United Nations. And so that through Andy Young, the movement for nonviolent social change is now being transmitted throughout the world. And that philosophy is so important in terms of focusing on people. And, most importantly, it's about people and relating to people and developing a trust. It's important. It's terribly important that we learn to live together and work out our problems together. And that's what the Sun is all about, too.
I want to ask you about that leadership because, and this is very personal, I covered your late husband's movement in the 1960s in the South and in Chicago, and it was a sense of excitement and commitment and all kind of a moral fervor that I haven't perceived of in the nation since then. You talked about benign neglect of the Nixon years. President Carter was accused of callous neglect by a group of black leaders that met with him about a year ago. What is your judgment? Put Andrew Young in with this, but what is your judgment of the nature of moral leadership of the Carter administration?
Well, my personal feeling, and I judge my feeling basically on the basis of what feels right to me, what's communicated to me, is that President Carter has set a new tone, moral tone in this country. And I would predict that within 4 years, we will begin to see and feel the changes. When he was campaigning, he talked about morality and spoke very freely about his religious convictions. And they criticized him about being born again. And I said as I campaigned, I'm glad he's been born again, because what he means is that he's been transformed, and Martin's movement transformed a lot of people. And it is important for people to be transformed. I wish more people could go through that transformation. We would have a better society. So that I think that there is a kind of a resurgence now. He spoke about human rights, and I was glad about that too, because Martin's movement always was a human rights movement. And so that when President Carter sort of brought it back into focus, when there was a period when it was, sort of, you don't talk about that because, had all these divisions and these factions and people were set against each other. Now there's an effort to bring people together again, and I think they are beginning to come together. It takes time, but I see very strong signs of that, and that kind of moral leadership. And when you get to know President Carter, you feel that he's sincere. Whether you think about him, whatever you think about him, but if you have one-to-one confrontation with him, you realize that the man is sincere. He believes what he's saying. And I watched him at the United Nations. He was there for 2 days. And he had a very positive effect on the ministers, foreign ministers. Over 100 of them had gathered there, the 149 nations in the United Nations, and some heads of states. And they were very impressed. They said he's sincere. And through Andy Young, there's been an openness that has been created within the United Nations, a feeling that we can talk to each other, and that we may not agree, but at least we can communicate. And I'm not afraid to say what I think about the United States because I won't be penalized.
What do you expect from Ambassador Young? What's his potential?
Well, it's Andy has tremendous potential in terms of national and international leadership. As far as I'm concerned, he is the best symbol. He's the best exponent, disciple of Martin Luther King Jr. Andy lives what he preaches, as Martin did. He's very honest. He's very open. He has the ability to inspire trust from all sorts of people, very conservative people. Even though they may not agree with him, they feel he's sincere. And they learn to trust him, and because he has a way of understanding, even though he won't agree with you.
He has a way of making you think. He jars you also.
Yeah, he jars you, but he also, that style, he and Carter have the same kind of style. I mean, it's very interesting. That's why they get along very well. They're pretty much the same style. And I think that, I think a real test of what Carter is and what he can become was the fact that you had 94% of people who still, many of them unsophisticated, but those are the people who don't analyze issues, who don't get involved in political machines and so on, but they judge you for what you are and what comes off to them, whether or not you're sincere. And that's a big test. I always believe that I believe in the power of the people. I believe that the people know what is good, and when you're sincere, and they choose their leaders. The fact that 94% were blacks and voted for Carter in this last election is highly significant. That could not have happened had there not been that movement that sensitized people, that moral force that Martin created, I think, which Carter had. And he becomes then the first important symbol, political symbol of reconciliation, which grew out of that movement. Now, the reason it is significant, I think, is when you look back and realize that Carter was the grandson of a former slave owner, and those people who voted for him were grandsons and daughters of former slaves, and they could trust a white Southerner enough to vote for him and elect a president. That's tremendous leverage.
That's the using of that Voting Rights Act, isn't it?
That's right, the Voting Rights Act. And I think that's tremendous leverage that we have, which is a part of the nonviolent social change process.
But how did you feel when this man that you're speaking of in glowing terms appointed Griffin Bell as Attorney General?
Well, I didn't feel very good about it at the time, but as I have learned Griffin Bell better, and knew that about some of the things he did, even when he was before he became as a judge, I learned to respect him more. And sometimes a person like a Griffin Bell can do a better job than the so-called liberals when they're given an opportunity and they're put in a setting where they are not penalized for what they do. And I think Griffin Bell is doing all right in the position he's in.
One of the great things about covering the movement of the 1950s and 60s was to see the leadership by black churches in this country and a minority of some white involvement in that movement. One doesn't sense that out of organized religion today as much. I saw a title of a paperback book I have in my home called God's Frozen People, and I was thinking about maybe that is a bit exaggerated, but what we could say about the church leadership today. How do you see, broadly speaking, church leadership? What is it and what should it be on these issues that you're addressing?
During the time when Martin Luther King was considered the moral leader of the moral conscience of the nation, there was more involvement of the church, and particularly the black church and the white church joined us in Selma in large numbers. In Birmingham, they certainly did not. The churches there were responsible for his writing that famous letter, which was so powerful, a letter from the Birmingham jail. But when we went to Selma, I think that letter in itself really touched the consciences of a lot of religious leaders, and it was circulated in the religious community. So I think they said when the opportunity presents itself again, I will not be caught in a position of not witnessing. So they came to Selma in large numbers, as you know. But it's so easy to slip back, you know. The church should be in the forefront, as Martin said, given leadership. And that is why I think it's so important to challenge them once again. And I don't know who's doing it, except that Martin Luther King still becomes, I think, that foremost symbol that we have to keep pointing toward. He is, in his time and in the future, I think, for years to come, will probably be the most important religious symbol, as well as, you know, he was so much more than that we have. I think, personally, Martin was destined to do what he did. He was God's revelation in history, and I think so often God has to reveal himself in history to his people.
When did you first recognize that?
Well, I don't know exactly when I first recognized it, but as I lived with Martin and saw him in action, I began to appreciate, the depth of his commitment. And I used to say to him, Martin, he said, there are certain things I believe in, and there are certain things I will not do, and so on. He said, but I'm not a perfect man. I have my faults. I'd be the first one to say that. But I said, Martin, you are the greatest Christian that I know. I respected him as a Christian statesman, but he was my husband and the father of my children. And so I saw him in all those roles and could appreciate him, I think, in all of them.
When you wrote your book, Your Years with Martin Luther King, you speak frequently of the side of him that those of us who were reporters and walked with him in the streets and the fields didn't necessarily see that much, but you speak of his great humor that he had and his interminable basketball games inside, which you couldn't stop.
Yeah, Martin had a great sense of humor, and we often wish that people, that his masses of his followers could know him as we knew him. He had to be very serious in public, and people get the impression that you're always serious and meditating. But Martin was just so human. That was one of the things that attracted me to him when I first met him. He was very serious about it. He says, when I get into the pulpit, when I'm preaching, he says, I'm very serious. He said, I will play. But when he was, outside of that context, he was human and playful and very much, he could be as playful as a 6-year-old child. I never shall forget the first Sunday I went to hear him preach when we were courting in Boston. My mother was visiting, and we went to the beach, and I forgot that famous beach in Boston, outside of Boston, but he went skating roller skating, and he had so much fun. He was just like a little child, and she had seen him preach that morning in the pulpit, and she just couldn't believe it. She says he acts like he's about 4 years old, but he was just having so much fun, just skating and just being another human being. He loved people, and his humor was, folk humor. He could tell jokes about himself and keep you laughing for hours. And yet, those people who did not know him and knew him, as a thinker and as a leader, could never imagine him being, that way. But to us, he was first of all just a fine human being that had all the frailties of every other human being. But at the same time, he had that serious moral bent, and he could only go so far in the direction of doing wrong because he was constrained, to a point. And I think that there's no question that Martin was God's gift again to America. And it's too bad that America has not yet appreciated that. I think one day America will.
One of the other great men that you wrote about in that book was your father. I was as moved about the writing about your father as I was practically anything in that book. He had a capacity to work. You're talking about giving people the simple dignity of working. He worked like few men work, and had it all taken away from him. Burned down his...
Well, yes, my father was such a strong person and has so much faith, and he's 78 years old today, and he still has that same faith and belief and love for people. He always was willing to forgive and ready to forgive and very understanding. And those qualities were qualities that I found in Martin. And I often said that, they were so much alike, and yet they had such different backgrounds. My father was Southern rural, and he was Southern urban and highly educated. My father only had a 6th grade education. But he was such a great, he is such a great spirit, and, that indomitable will and determination to keep on keeping on when there's just nothing, left. I remember the day when our house was burned, and when we finally got the message, he had gone to work that day. He got up as if nothing had happened, gone to work.
He had no time or capacity for bitterness, did he?
No, he has no bitterness. He's just such a great forgiving heart, and that's the kind of family, that, who I grew up in, and I have so much respect for him, and of course my mother too. They're both great human beings, and gave me my values. I think people are very lucky when they have good parents, because children very often, children are not really responsible, because the first 6 years, I believe, are the most important years of your life. And if you don't have your values instilled early, it's harder to learn them. You may learn them and you may not. But my parents, even though they were poor and they had to struggle against the segregation and discrimination there, period, they always believed in the future and that things could be better, and that the route to liberation was through an education. And so they gave us the values, my sister, my brother, and I, these values that they held. And those values were strengthened as I went on through Antioch College. And when I met Martin in Boston, I had my values and I had my commitment. I didn't learn it from Martin, but Martin, I think, gave me an opportunity to fulfill it.
It was a great wedding, so to speak.
Yes, I think it was, kind of destined. It was meant to be. I didn't realize it until later. I think I did realize it after we got to Montgomery, and the boycott had started, and our house had been bombed, and there was such a great feeling of something very important happening that was worldwide, and we were a part of it, and it was a very great privilege to be a part of it. I remember thinking, I feel so fortunate to be here today and to be a part of this. And this is the reason why we came to Montgomery. Now I understand. And as we went along in the movement and the drama began to continue to unfold, you begin to see more and more. And then you realize that the testing came and you had to be tested over and over again. When Martin was stabbed, that was a testing point in our lives. And you know, each campaign he was criticized and we continued to be tested. And then when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, in the midst of all of that, then there was an attack from Hoover. And there was more testing. And then he spoke out against the war in Vietnam and more testing, you know, and all the way throughout his life, you know. So that, you know, someone said it so well, when you totally commit your life, there's nothing to be puffed up about. They said Martin had humility. Well, you have to have humility. Because you are not your own. I mean, once you make that commitment and submit yourself to God's will, then you are not in control. You become an instrument, and because when you become puffed up, then you cease to be God's instrument. And this is what people don't understand. And I put it in those terms because Martin was a religious man. And he was an ecumenical symbol. What he stood for transcended race, class, culture, religion, you know, all of those artificial barriers. And so some people may call it something else. You don't have to be religious, you know, but the fact is you're moral. I mean, you found something that you could believe in. But it was this great symbol of goodness and of a symbol of love. Love, I think it's so important. He had the capacity to love those who hated him. And that great love that he possessed emanated from him to other people. And much of it was returned. That love transcended even continents, because when I traveled abroad, I realized what great love people had for Martin who never knew him.
He told you before he died, if anything happened to him, you must carry on. Were you ever tempted to drop out? Were you ever tempted to say, I can't carry on, I can't go to the UN, I can't take on the full employment issue, I'm going to be a part of the me generation and stay home and watch TV? Ever tempted?
No, because I couldn't. Because my commitment, as I stated, I had my commitment when I met Martin. I always had a sense of mission. And I had it when I met Martin. And I probably would have been doing some things similar. I don't know, but I was going to make my contribution, I thought, through music. But I realized that when Martin was no longer there, I was always involved, that I was not only married to the man I loved, but I was also married to the cause. And we shared that cause, and I had that cause when he was no longer there. So I couldn't.
But so many people got tired.
I stayed home.
So many people got tired, and you just keep on. What is it?
Because I believe in it, and I believe very strongly in my philosophy of life is that there is a plan and a purpose for each one of our lives, and if we rediscover it and embrace it, then we are fulfilled as individuals. And if it usually is attached to something that is going to help people, usually if it's a great cause. And that keeps you going. That is the thing that keeps you going, because you feel that your life is worthwhile, that you're doing something that's worthwhile, and it gives meaning to you. So many people don't have any purpose for their lives.
What about your children? Have you infected them with this great sense of cause and commitment? Will we see them emerge now? They're getting older.
They will make their contributions in their own way. I said to them, you don't have to do it the way Martin and I did it. You will make your contribution. The main thing is to give them our values, which we've done, and all of them are highly motivated towards service.
What are they doing? Tell me.
Well, Yolanda is a graduate student, second year in drama, working for Wiafe at NYU, and she's going to be an actress. She is an actress, and she's is going to do that, but she also is interested in community theater. So one day she wants to come back to Atlanta and work here, but she wants to serve the cause. And Martin III is a junior at Morehouse College, and he's interested in politics and religion. He's making, he's going to make his own contribution. Because he's Martin III, I had very great concern about him because I wasn't sure how he was going to wear the name, but he's worn it extremely well. He's very balanced, knows who he is. All the kids know who they are. Dexter Scott, the third child, is the son, and he wants to be an engineer and wants to go to Morehouse College. He's between a junior and a senior in school, and he went to one of those ungraded schools, so he kind of got his class level messed up. So Dexter is a highly creative person and very sensitive. All of them are, and he's going to make his contribution too. They all, I think, are interested in people. Bonnie is 14, Dexter's 16, Ward is 20, and York is 22. Bonnie is the youngest, and she says she wants to be a politician, just like that. And when she was asked who her model or idol or who politician she admired, she says Uncle Andy. And of course, she may study law beforehand. We're not quite sure because she's only ninth grade, but they all share in the work that I'm doing. They're involved with the center. Martin and Yoki are on the board of directors, and they have allowed me to do what I'm doing. They understood what their daddy was doing because I taught them that he was doing God's work and he was helping people. And they feel very strongly about the cause. They go to church. They have no bitterness and resentment toward what happened to their dad.
They never did?
Never did. I think it's the power
That's
of
really
love,
nice.
and I think it's, I feel very fortunate, and I said, it has to be the grace of God, because those kids could have been scarred for life, but they're going to be all right.
Where are you with your music?
Well, I'm still going to do my Freedom concert, recorded, and I'm in the process of getting back into my practicing.
Do you work at it every day?
I don't work at it every day, but I work at it a little long, and it takes time to kind of build it out. But I do plan to do some singing during this year.
What's your day like?
Well, I get up around 6:30, sometimes earlier if I have work that I need to do when it's quiet. And I don't usually go to bed I don't usually go to sleep till after midnight. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Many times when I'm involved in the annual program of the Martin Luther King Center, which takes place in January, around the 15th, I spend about 2 months getting about 4 hours of sleep a night, and that is a very, very strenuous period. But most of my hours awake, I'm involved, because you see, I don't separate one activity from another. Everything I do, I see it as, part of the struggle, because it's a way of life for me, and it's a way of life for the children. I don't separate the children out. I'm involved with my work, and I'm doing things with the kids, and people will tell you when they call me on the telephone and I'm at home, and I'll have to stop and say something to one of the kids about some mundane thing, about a schedule and where they're going to be and when do they want to be picked up and things like that. And I may be involved in very serious conversation. I have to, operate at all these different levels at one time. Because I'm a mother. Essentially, I'm a homemaker because I like keeping house. But I would be very unhappy if that's all I could do and that's all I had to do.
Do you still have a volume of mail to deal with?
Yes, tremendous volume of mail. Unfortunately, I don't get my mail answered. I just don't. I can't. I don't have the staff resources that I need to do it. Martin never handled all of his mail. All kinds of requests. You can't You see, in a cause organization where you have to raise the money from the public, you can't hire enough staff to answer mail because a lot of it is goodwill mail and it's good public relations, but it doesn't bring any income to carry on the work. And the work of the center is so tremendous and important because it's not only national that we're concerned about, but international. We're developing the international component in the next years, and so in the cultural component, and we see this as the perpetuation of the philosophy and the strategies for nonviolent social change. And we have programs already that are in progress, teaching leadership, young people, old people, to understand the process of social change which Martin used. And there are very definite steps in that process.
I was going to ask you, do you teach how it would seem to me that there's a different agenda or a different style or different techniques that might apply to the 70s and 1980s from the 1950s and 60s. I mean, you must be very into that.
Essentially, the process is the same. Most people haven't understood the process. Let me see if I can explain it quickly. The process includes five or six or seven steps, depending on whether you combine steps. The first step is to investigate the problem. Whatever the issue is, investigate it. That means doing some research and so on. Then once you understand what it is, the next step is to educate. You educate yourself, educate people working with you, educate the community. At the same time, you also have to engage in some kind of purification if you're in a struggle where you may have to sacrifice sometimes a job in these
privacy.
Your privacy. You have to prepare yourself for the sacrifice. In Martin's time, it might have meant meditating, withdrawing, and meditating. Gandhi did. It also meant going to mass meetings night after night where people would reinforce, their own commitments and get strength from each other. We used to sing and pray, and sometimes people didn't understand what that was. But what we were doing, we're getting ourselves prepared. Something about the music and the singing and the praying, which we believed in. And then after that, you state your demands to the person who is inflicting the injustice. And when you go and state your demands, then you ask for something to be done about them. And you negotiate, so to speak. You begin to negotiate. If negotiations don't work, then you engaged in public demonstrations, boycotting, picketing, sanctions, what have you. Now, we saw the public demonstrations during my husband's time, the marches and so on, and that's what we understood. We didn't understand that Martin also coupled his campaign with voter registration, politicizing people, and some form of sanctions.
Speaking.
Right. Then if you do this job well with the sanctions, like in Birmingham, the reason the merchants negotiated was because we had an effective boycott of the downtown area. We said we would buy nothing but medicine and food for 3 months. An effective economic boycott will usually bring people around to negotiating. Once you do that, you're going to create some problems and resentments and so on. You have to reconcile. Once it's over, then you forgive and you reconcile and you try to work together. You don't keep on saying, well, they mistreated us and we're not going to work with them. You have to reconcile. That's another step. And then after the reconciliation, and in the process of the reconciliation, we won a voting rights bill. And what that did was help to create some new structures. So then you recreate. You begin the process of transformation and recreating and building new structures. And that is the process.
Where in that process are you on the issue of full employment?
Well, we still need to do more educating, and we've been, the negotiation it comes when we, with the bill in Congress, we've done some negotiating.
That's your arena right now. So
We're negotiating.
negotiating.
Yeah. Now, if negotiations don't work, and the Congress doesn't hear us, we may have to engage in some public demonstrations.
How much time? What's
And
your
we may
timetable?
have to engage also in some sanctions, you know.
Well, that's what I've been wondering.
Right.
What's your timetable?
Well, we should have a bill this year. We're now in next year, 78, in this session of Congress. Now, we're not going to be able to wait much longer than that because I think the problem is so severe, and those people who are deprived, who don't have jobs, are not going to be able to continue, I think, to wait. If you give people victories and if there's some hope, you know, they're willing to go along. And this is what Martin often said many times when we were in the 60s during that period. He said, give us some victories. You can't keep people nonviolent, you know, unless they have some victories. He says, violence is the language of the unheard. And when people cannot communicate and cannot be heard otherwise, then, you know, they have to be heard some way. So then they react in all kinds of negative ways. So I hope that this will not happen. I don't think it will, because we have an open government now. The government listens. Now, but the government cannot do it by itself. The power of the people is necessary in terms of putting pressure on the Congress. And when we had the march in Washington, there were people who said, let's put the pressure on the White House. Martin said, let's put it on Congress.
There's another voice. It's a voice out of Chicago, the voice of Jesse Jackson, who is saying, let's put the pressure on ourselves. He's emphasizing self-discipline, homework, old personal values. Get up early in the morning, work hard, don't take a handout. What do you think of that?
Well, I feel that when you take only that position, you let people off the hook who are oppressing you, and you relieve them of their guilt. Now, the problems in our society, the problems that black people and people have, are not their own making. I mean, it is the way society is structured. So we've got to change the structures. That's why Martin focused on the structures. He said, don't focus on the individuals. He said, I can never hate an Eastland or George Wallace. He said, I must love them. But you focus on the system that corrupts these people. We've got to change the system. We've got to work on changing the system so that people will not be corrupt. You can't say to people, yes, I believe we've got to teach our children those values. But if you only preach that, then I think you're missing the boat. And the other thing is that it gives the reactionary forces a chance to say, you know, they're responsible for their own problems. And, you know, everybody knows that we're not responsible for our problems totally. You know, some things we can do for ourselves, but some things, it's like Martin used to say, it's a cruel jest to ask a bootless man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. If you don't have any boots, how can you lift yourself up? And some of our people have been so deprived and so everything taken away from them. You know, they have nothing hardly to build on. So you've got to help them. You've got to give them help in many different kinds of ways. So I have to say that that philosophy is one that is akin to those people who say, you know, I did it on my own. Nobody's ever done it on their own. Everybody has had help. I had help. I mean, I had help from my parents, but I also had help from teachers who were loving and caring, who saw something in me and who believed in me, and you know, helped me along the way. And I had scholarships and so on. And I didn't want to take scholarships at a point. But after a while, I said, you know, I deserve it just as much as anybody else. You know? And but it took me a long time, you know, after a while. We don't like handouts. And I don't think anybody really does. But the system sometimes beat people down so that, you know, that they just, you know, they have nothing to hope for and to look forward to. And it takes all of us, you know, and it takes parents, and it takes people who have goodwill, who care, to encourage and give encouragement, and that has to be done. But you can't just do it by yourself. I mean, these kids need help. But the system's got to be changed too. You got to work on both things.
Did James Earl Ray act alone, do you think, in assassinating your husband?
I cannot feel that Martin's assassination was the act of one man, because it was so well planned, and it had to be done by very highly sophisticated team. James Earl Ray is not that bright. There are a number of things that we know, and that is not a public record, that lead you to believe that Martin Luther King Jr.'s death was not the act of a single individual. Now, it is true that in the FBI report, as Martin was under surveillance continuously. His phone was tapped. The person allegedly who was the communist that he was getting directions from, his phone was never tapped. He was used as an excuse to tap Martin's phone. And this person was vindicated, but Martin's phone was still tapped. They followed him to Oslo, and in the records, if you read the records, you would feel that Martin Luther King was the worst person in the world, that he had no morality, and that he contributed nothing to the society. And this was the FBI and the CIA. It's all contrived. And then at a point, when Martin, after the Poor People's Campaign, the Vietnam War, the report said it is now time to get rid of Martin Luther King Jr. And within a very short period of time, he was assassinated.
Do you want that inquiry to continue?
I think that Martin's death will be vindicated. I don't know how, but the righteousness of his cause and his deep commitment to truth and love, I think, will assure the vindication of his death.
Thank you. My guest this evening, Coretta Scott King. I'm John Calloway. Good night.